SoundCartel.
In this episode, we go behind the numbers of the latest Australian Infinite Dial survey with Larry Rosin, President and co-founder of Edison Research. We look at how Australia compares to the US, changing habits during the pandemic, and the real impact of radio on podcasting.
I think catch-up radio has a much more limited appeal than bespoke podcasts built as podcasts, or at least that's the evidence we have here in the United States.
From SoundCartel, I'm Nick Schildberger, and this is Podcasting Essentials. Welcome to episode 7 of season 4. And welcome once again to my co-host, Nicole Goodman.
Hey Nick, happy to be here with you again. This is an episode we've been looking forward to since the release of the Australian Infinite Dial survey back in May.
Yes, and for those who may not know, the Infinite Dial Australia explores the penetration of online digital audio in Australia, as well as the online platforms and technologies that Australians are using. It's been conducted in the US by Edison Research all the way back to 1998. And in Australia, this is the 4th year they've done the survey here. So we're starting to get a good picture of the trends in Australia versus the US and also a bunch of other countries as well now.
That's right. And the results again this year were really positive. There have been increases in all the right places, so podcasting is still performing well and a strong growth medium, even though some of the data stuck out as a bit strange compared to the US, Nick.
Yes, and we're going to discuss that in detail with Larry Rosin from Edison Research. But before we get to the interview, Nicole, could you run through some of the headline stats from the 2020 Infinite Dial Australia?
Absolutely. And we'll put a link to the full report in the show notes. But just to give you the top line stats, podcast awareness in Australia has increased from 83% last year to 87% in 2020, putting us ahead of the US, which is only at 75%.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, isn't it? But we'll dive into that a bit later.
Yeah. Yet the weekly and monthly listening numbers are higher in the US at 24% and 37% respectively, even though these numbers have increased in Australia to 17% and 25%. Radio is still the most listened to audio in car at 83%. And second is CD listening at 32%, ahead of podcasting, which is at 14%.
Yeah, that didn't grow as much as I thought. But we'll talk more about that as well.
We'll get to that later, yeah. In Australia, the number of people who've ever listened to a podcast has increased to 32%. And to finish with smart speakers, we're more aware of smart speakers at 85%, which is higher than in the US. And yet fewer of us actually own smart speakers.
This is true, but there's been a huge increase in the number of purchases in the last 3 years of smart speakers in Australia. So there's definitely going to be a lot more smart speakers entering homes in the years to come. Some really interesting stats there. Thanks, Nick. And I look forward to discussing it in more detail with Larry. So let's get to that interview right now.
Larry, thank you so much for joining us on Podcasting Essentials. It's a real pleasure to be speaking to you.
Of course, happy to be with you.
So, Larry, this is the 4th year that the Infinite Dial has been conducted in Australia. What have been the biggest trends that you've seen?
Well, we've been tracking along, looking at any number of statistics with regard to audio, digital audio, radio podcasts, device ownership, etc. So the two hot topics in the world of audio continue to be podcasting and smart speakers. It's been interesting to watch that in certain areas, Australia is ahead of the United States. In certain things, it's a little bit behind. And so it's been fun to compare the data from Infinite Dial Australia to Infinite Dial USA, just so we can get a sense for where the Americans are relative to you, and you can get the same sense relative to the USA.
In the US, you've got a much larger data set going back to 1998. Does Australia mirror the US, or are there trends that do set us apart?
Yeah, so we're looking at many of the same things across the two. In particular, with regard to podcasting, I think it's been very interesting to track all 4 years that we've done the study. In every case, through the 4 years, awareness of the term podcasting has been significantly higher in Australia than we see in the United States. And yet, interestingly, every other statistic we ask about podcasting, have you ever listened to one? Have you listened to one in the last month or in the last week? Those are all lower. And it's very unusual to see that in a data set, to see where awareness is higher, but usage is lower. Usually they're sort of connected. These are all statistics that are sort of, I always say they're tied by a string. So usually if you yank up awareness, you will typically see usage yanked up similarly. But this has been the case now for all 4 years. So it can't be anything but what's the story here. But the best theory I have, and I think it's a legitimate theory, is at the same time that we see this differential in the podcasting story, the data shows that radio listening, broadcast radio listening, is stronger in Australia. It's more robust than it is in the United States. And your broadcasters talk about podcasting a lot. And they started talking about it sooner than broadcasters in the United States did. So I think you've pushed the term, but to date, there hasn't been enough incentive for people to check out podcasting. And that's the best theory we have as to why the awareness of the term is higher, but the usage of the product so far has been lower.
Yeah, it's really interesting, the comparison between radio. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. Last year was a watershed moment in the US with 51% of the population having ever listened to a podcast. And you mentioned just now that in Australia, where we have a lower percentage at only 32% of the population having ever listened. And that puts us about 5 years behind the US, despite that greater awareness, as you discussed. So do you think there's something that we could do here to help catch up to the US?
Yeah, I think there's a lot. I think that to date, many Australians seem to be under the misapprehension that all podcasting is catch-up radio, if you will, the chance to hear a breakfast show or other show that ran, say, earlier that day or earlier that week and listen to it later. And I think catch-up radio has a much more limited appeal than bespoke podcasts built as podcasts, or at least that's the evidence we have here in the United States. And so my belief is that as more podcasts are developed for Australians in your accent about the topics that Australians are interested in, and people sort of understand the world of podcasting, there's so many tens and hundreds of thousands of topics that are being covered in podcasts, or concepts of podcasts, or things to listen to. As that becomes a little bit more Australianized and Australians understand that it's not merely catch-up radio, it's not just hearing what the breakfast team yucked it up about this morning, I think that could really turn the key for Australian podcasting. Once people understand how much more it is and how much more it can be than just catch-up radio.
Yeah, it's only my opinion, but I think calling radio shows podcasts, it's actually doing the industry almost a disservice. I think that just making a radio show available as a podcast is really on-demand radio, which is different to podcasting. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, from the technical perspective, it's a podcast, right? But I totally understand the gist of what you're saying, that it's not that sort of sometimes almost magical experience of what a great podcast can be. And so, again, I think some of that's lost on Australians who think it's nothing more than just listening to something they may have chosen not to listen to in the first place. It may not be that they missed it. Maybe they don't want to hear it at all. And it comes down to, at least my opinion is, per your point, is that obviously radio and podcasts are very close cousins. And certainly some radio shows have made wonderful podcasts. Here in the United States, certain public radio shows like This American Life and Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me have actually functioned better as podcasts than they ever did as radio shows. And they are great radio shows, but they're even better as podcasts. And I think that's the rare case, right, where something was actually better in that transformation. With the exception of those rare cases, they are, like I said, close cousins, but they are different media forms. And there's so much innovation going on in the podcasting space and things that work great as podcasts that really wouldn't make good radio shows. And it sometimes just people need that key turned in their head, if you will, to understand what a podcast can be so much more than their sort of limited perspective on what talk radio or speech-based radio of any kind might be. So again, I think it's sort of a learning process, and it's often from the most prosaic forms. And there's still cases where someone will say, what's a podcast? And then you have to go through the whole explanation. And I think as that happens more and more, and people understand that this medium is different and often, like I said, often highly entertaining, highly informational, highly inspiring at times, more people will sort of get podcasting. And then I think it'll proliferate down there in the same way it has here. All that to say, I speak at lots of podcasting conferences, and we produce a lot of data about podcasting. I think there's tons and tons of growth left for podcasting, but it's never going to be for everybody. I think there's a lot of people who just, for whatever reason, if they have space in their lives for audio, they will always choose music because that excites them and inspires them and entertains them more. So you have to bear that in mind. It'll never hit the kind of numbers that, say, primetime television used to hit, or if you totaled up primetime TV plus now streaming, those kinds of numbers. But there's tons of growth out there for podcasting.
Larry, you touched on this a bit earlier, but Australians love their radio, especially in the car, and it's the number one listening habit in car at 83% here. Why do Australians listen to so much radio?
Well, I think the most obvious reason is because it's really good radio. Unlike plenty of other countries, certainly I would say here in the United States, radio in Australia remains sort of a key rung on the entertainment ladder. The radio stations there tend to be extremely well-resourced. You are still churning out and creating new radio stars, something that's gone to be exceptionally rare here in the United States, where there's just not the talent development and sort of this orientation towards star performers and things of that nature. Your stations do a lot of marketing and advertising, and I think it's just more vital and has more sort of urgency tied to it. So I think people listen to radio because it's good. And I think they listen more in Australia than they do in the United States for that reason.
The other thing that fascinated me, the second most popular in-car audio that Aussies are listening to are CDs at 32%. That's way more than podcasts, which is sitting at 14%. So why are CDs still so popular?
Well, it's funny because when people think about the in-car audio consumption environment, they forget, I certainly do not know this statistic for Australia, but the average car in the American road is 11 years old. That's the average. Technology changes really, really slowly in the in-car environment. So for a lot of people in both countries, they've driven a car for a long time, or they're driving an older car that they bought used or got as a hand-me-down or something like that. And there's very limited options, right? There's the radio and the CD player in many, many cases. So that right there is the explanation. That's what's available. With regard to podcasting in the car, a lot of podcasters get very frustrated at how small the numbers are in terms of what percentage of people are listening to podcasts in their car and how much time is spent listening to podcasts in the car. It's still, for most people in most cases, not a terribly seamless experience to listen to a podcast in the car. If you don't want to stream it, which many people would not, you have to remember when you're in Wi-Fi to download a podcast. And the other thing people forget is that, well, maybe commute times are relatively long, and I don't know what they are in Australia, but here in the US, they average 25 minutes each way.
It's about the same here. Yeah.
Okay. So that's a reasonable space of time. But you have to also just think about the length of the average drive, not just your two commutes, say, to and from work on a given day, but driving to the grocery store, driving the kids to school, or just all this sort of mundane, relatively brief drives that people typically take in their lives. And I think our research, we do a lot of qualitative research about podcasts, and just even for podcast fans in many cases, it's just too much work to think to put on a podcast and listen to it, and to want to listen to it in chunks because the drives themselves are relatively short, and then connect an aux cord or through Bluetooth or whatever. And as I said, radio is good in Australia, better than here in the United States, but it's plenty good here. And it's easy. And they have a lifetime of habituation of listening to either the radio or CD in the car. You're trying to get someone to develop a new behavior, to be so compelled by podcasting that they take the steps to connect their phone or to prepare and think about what they're going to listen to, et cetera. It's just a lot of steps. And as it becomes easier, as it becomes more seamless, as things like Android Auto and Apple CarPlay proliferate, I think you'll see those numbers go up. But again, only 5% or so of the car stock typically turns over every year. So it's going to be a slow, incremental story.
Now, Larry, I'd like to turn to smart speakers for a moment. This is another area that in Australia we have higher awareness than in the US, but much less ownership. We're about 10% behind. And that's despite massive growth. It's grown from 5% to 17% ownership since 2018. Do you see this growth continuing, first of all? And then also, what are the opportunities for smart speakers?
My prediction is yes. I don't see why it wouldn't catch up. I think the only reason your numbers lag the American numbers, which are about 2 years behind, is they were introduced here much earlier, and Amazon is pushed incredibly hard here in the United States. The price points are very, very low, and the technology keeps getting better and better. So I think it's an extremely safe bet that your numbers, they may continue to lag the numbers in the United States, but they will continue to track along. And in as much as they continue to grow in the US, I think they'll grow in Australia as well. With regard to the opportunities, they're really endless. For one thing, for radio broadcasters, it's a new way for people to access your content. You just have to train your listeners to invoke your radio station by teaching them what to say. And of course, having it available as a stream that's easily found by Google and Amazon. Podcasting has proved to be a bit of a challenge in this environment. If you want to listen to a podcast that's the only thing you would typically want to listen to is the most recent episode, it works pretty well. But if you are trying to listen to something that has a serialized aspect to it and you're trying to listen to it from front to back, it often is extremely difficult to get it to play the episode that you want. Again, it comes down to that ease of use and seamlessness. And you would think that they might put a little more energy in solving the problem of podcasting. And then, of course, there's a lot of usage for pure play music services, Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Music, et cetera, because a lot of people use them for music. And that's sort of what comes out of the box. I mean, it's human nature to just ask for a song or ask for an artist. And these products are going to gear themselves straight to their product. So you pull an Amazon smart speaker out of the box and say, play Led Zeppelin or play Taylor Swift or whatever you want to hear. They're going to go to Amazon Music. And so there's a lot of usage of those pure plays.
Now, speaking of those music streaming services, your survey also showed that paid subscriptions are increasing quite steadily. Do you think this is a trend that consumers are becoming used to because of the likes of Wondery Plus and other podcasting services that have got the paid service? And will we see more of that?
We didn't really track paid podcasting services in this survey. And those, at least here in the United States, they're extremely small to date. I think there's an opportunity there. I think people have shown, per your question, in a million different ways, that when great content is available, they will pay for it. And Netflix is certainly the ultimate example of that. And here in the States and elsewhere, HBO and Amazon Prime Music and all manner of different television or video streaming products show that people will pay for content when it's high-level content and easily used. Spotify obviously is proving that all over the world, that people will pay to eliminate commercials and enhance the experience. There's many people who think no one will ever pay for podcasts. I'm not someone who feels that way. I think very few people are paying for podcasts now, but that doesn't mean people wouldn't. And I tell this story about, it's now many, many years ago, but when they were researching the idea of satellite television in the UK, they did a survey and asked about, would you like more channels? And the overwhelming answer was more channels. We have 4 channels. What else could there possibly be? There's always 4 different things on. And so it was overwhelming. People said, no, I don't want more channels. Well, they went through and did it anyway. And of course, it was quickly adopted all over the UK, as it has been all over the world, cable or satellite or expanded services. Sometimes people don't know they want to pay for something until they want to pay for something.
Larry, the research for this report was done in the first quarter of 2020, so just prior to COVID-19 lockdown. Do you think the pandemic has changed how we're listening and the types of content that we're consuming? And are there genres, durations, or other trends that brands should be aware of that are in demand?
What changed overwhelmingly was the location of listening. As you might expect, way more at home listening, way less in the car listening, way less at work listening. And we asked specifically about where you are. So even if you're working from home, the way we're doing the research, you would put that in home and not work. But when we looked inside the locations, things did not change very much. We knew what people listened to at home before the disruptions. We found way more at-home listening during the disruptions. But what, interestingly, we didn't find was that people changed what they listened to at home. Similarly, in the car, there was a lot less in-car listening, but what people listened to in their cars were pretty much the same. The change was the location, and a lot of listening is linked to the location. But within those locations, nothing really changed. And trying to answer the first part of your question. Then you went on to ask about genres and sort of what certain individual choices that people are making. At first, we saw that news-based podcasts definitely started getting more listening, and true crime, which has really been the backbone of a lot of American, it's just something that really has clicked with listeners in the podcasting frame. That started to drop quite a bit. Similarly, just in radio, we saw news radio go up within radio and other forms of music radio kind of go down as the news became more urgent. Sports was completely suspended. So sports radio and sports podcasts dropped pretty dramatically because there was very little to talk about. So we definitely saw some changes in what people were choosing to listen to. But the big story was just simply where people were. And they kept their behaviors wherever they were in very different amounts.
So just to clarify there, the listening numbers that you're seeing have been fairly consistent?
Well, when you ask about listening numbers, for instance, radio listening dropped, and it dropped somewhat dramatically. Not as much as people thought it might, but it dropped quite a bit. But it wasn't this rejection of radio. It was simply what I said before. The car is a huge part of radio listening, and people were spending a lot less time in their cars. So radio listening naturally dropped. The amount of time people spent listening to the radio dropped. And for some people, the only place they listened to the radio was in their car. So if they were no longer getting in their cars, they were not listening to any radio in those cases. Things that are done more at home went up. So our figures here for streaming audio rose because people do that more at home and people are spending more time at home. And certain other things that people use at home here, like using YouTube for music, or we have these cable music channels on television and things like that. Those tended to rise because people were spending more time at home.
Yeah, it's interesting and probably going to continue for the foreseeable future as well.
Yeah, that's right.
That is really going to be a huge thing to watch, which is people talk about things going back to normal. And personally, I think certain things, the history books will look at pre and post 2020 and see major changes. And I think the work from home phenomenon for people who are lucky enough to be able to work from home, I think there's no way that genie is getting stuffed back into the bottle. I think people are showing that they can work effectively from home. And so if they were in the past expected to come to an office or another kind of workplace 5 days a week, I find it hard to believe that even if a magic vaccine comes along and no one feels any fear at all, you're going to easily get people that come back 5 days a week in most cases. But, it'll be some sort of 3 and 2 in a lot of workplaces, et cetera. If for no other reason that the managers of companies are looking at what they're spending on rent and saying, gee, it turns out we can spend half as much on rent or even less if we have some of our workforce working from home. I am really deeply skeptical that in-car listening patterns will ever revert to what they were in February of this year. But look, predictions are hard, and I don't know who predicted this crisis, and lots of things that come along were never predicted. So you guys could easily ring me up in a year and say, look, in-car listening's higher than ever or whatever, and tell me my prediction was wrong.
I personally am on the same side of the fence as you. I think that we don't know what 2021 will be like, but it's going to be different to 2020 and it's going to most likely be very different to previous years. So
it's a new world.
We will see. What do you see as the risks, Larry, for podcasts? Outside of blind enthusiasm, what should the industry be wary of or mitigate for from other audio or communication mediums?
Well, my radio friends will often get perturbed with me with one part of the answer, which is there's a certain sound and style to radio really throughout the world where even forgetting music radio and what that sounds like, but just sort of what the commercials sound like and what the talent sounds like, and podcasts have tended to sound very different. And I think as radio companies show so much interest in podcasting, as they absolutely should, you often can hear a creeping radio-ness come into podcasting. And for some people, that's maybe a positive, but for others, that's definitely a negative. And while I think the numbers are lower in Australia than in the United States, a typical 1-hour podcast here in the States, maybe you'll have 2 or 3 minutes of ads at the most. And a typical hour of radio here will have at least 10 minutes of commercials, but often significantly more than that. And radio broadcasters who are now getting involved in podcasting look at 2 minutes and go, gee whiz, let's sell another 3 or 5 or 10 more minutes into that hour. When you talk about risks, that's what pops into my mind. Sort of ruining the specialness of the medium. And to date, podcasting has gotten incredibly high rates for its ads because they've been so effective. I really fear that if there's 10 minutes of commercials in an hour-long podcast, the effectiveness will go down. Therefore, the prices will go down. Therefore, the pressure to run even more ads will go up. And so that's one of the things that I really worry about when you say risks to podcasting.
It's a balance, though, isn't it, between, you said earlier that for podcasting to continue to grow, we need to be producing higher quality shows, and there needs to be a way to monetize those shows as well. So we need to find ways to keep growing the audiences, keep growing the quality, but at the same time finding ways to bring the revenue in.
Right. It's amazing because lots of radio here in the United States gets single digits cost per thousand. 10 is considered a massive home run. Whereas podcasts are sitting at $30 and $35 cost per thousand. So you can make the numbers work off the much higher CPMs,
yes,
and often very relatively low cost. And what I shudder to think about is a world where podcasting cost per thousand drop into the single digits, forcing, like you were implying, forcing lots and lots of commercials. And I think all that'll do in an on-demand environment is just have everyone skipping them all and not listening to them, which will drive down the power of those commercials and the effectiveness of those commercials even worse. There's really troublesome scenarios with that. What people love and sort of treasure about podcasts is, to date, the overwhelming majority of cases, they haven't been tarnished in that fashion.
Larry, final question. We like to do some crystal balling here. 5 years from now, what do you believe will be the impact of podcasting? And what are going to be the biggest changes to the Infinite Dial for 2025?
No pressure.
Wow. Yeah, really. Obviously, if you had asked me that question 1 year ago today, I wouldn't have predicted anything, literally like anything that's happened over the last 3 months, right? It would never have even crossed my mind, nor anybody's really, sadly.
Yeah.
I wish there were people out there who maybe thought about this stuff a little bit more. So 5 years out is completely impossible. I think it is much more likely than not that we will continue to see podcasting going up at that point, at least in terms of things like weekly usage and number of podcasts that individuals listen to. That will continue to rise. I remain very bullish on podcasting. I don't think it'll be a straight line, but so far there's been, in a relatively compact period of time, some real innovations in the space. Like we were saying, it started out, it was mostly just repackaged radio programs. And then 2014 Serial comes along. And it really was unprecedented, this sort of self-contained mini-series, if you will, and something that people were waiting every Thursday for the next update. And then, of course, that got emulated so many times. And it's only a few years ago where the idea of a daily podcast, or at least 5 days a week podcast, was entirely new to the world. And actually, the New York Times and NPR, National Public Radio here in the States, almost simultaneously launched daily podcasts, which was a wildly daring act. I mean, today it doesn't seem that daring, but it was really a daring act. And then smart speakers came along and people were repackaging podcasts as flash briefings and different ways to package things that. So there's been so much innovation already in a relatively short period of time. There's plenty of other innovations. You guys mentioned briefly paying for podcasts, putting things behind a paywall, different business models. A lot of celebrities have flown into the space. So there's so much innovation that's an easy prediction. There will continue to be innovation. There will continue to be new ideas. And even if someone has sort of resisted the call of podcasting up to some point, one of those next innovations maybe then pushes that person into using the medium, et cetera. So I'm very optimistic. I'm very bullish on certainly the next 5 years of podcasting.
Well, so are we. And I like the word there that you use, daring. I hope that brands that are listening and other producers are daring in the things that they try and do with podcasting, and that we see more innovation like Serial. And that was about 5 years ago, so hopefully we see some big things in the next 5 years.
Absolutely.
Yes, definitely.
Larry, thank you so much. We are so privileged to have you on the show. We've been looking forward to it, and we thank you for taking the time out of your evening to sit with us and talk about these really interesting data points.
Yeah, thanks so much, Larry.
Of course. Always happy to do it.
Well, one thing's for sure, podcasting ain't going to kill the radio star.
No, not yet, Nick.
No, not for some time, I wouldn't have thought. I found Larry's comparison between radio and podcasting really fascinating, and the explanation about why awareness here is higher but not translating to podcast listenership so much is actually linked to the quality of radio here being so good. And yeah, it's true, I hadn't thought about the fact that radio personalities here in Australia are huge celebrities.
Yeah, stars.
And the quality of network shows and the stuff the ABC produces is top-notch radio, and we're very lucky to have that.
I think with radio, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, and perhaps it's stunting podcasting a little bit. It's great because radio's been introducing people to podcasting. They mention it a lot. They say the word podcasting a lot. But largely they're pushing listeners to listen to their own podcast channels. So if the first introduction to podcasting is essentially on-demand radio, that takes away from the core of what podcasting is. A dynamic and entertaining way to deliver content to listeners that doesn't follow the format of radio.
Radio really is the friend and foe, isn't it?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Without radio, podcasting wouldn't be where it is, but perhaps it is holding it back slightly. So perhaps there needs to be a better way to differentiate the two so that we can encourage people to understand that there's so many podcasting styles and opportunities for listeners. And as Larry said, for brands, be daring and create truly interesting content.
He was absolutely right, 100%.
Well, that's it for this episode of Podcasting Essentials. Thanks, Nicole, for joining me as always.
My absolute pleasure, Nick.
To find out more about how we can help you create a podcast, check out our website at soundcartel.com.au. And don't forget to listen to our own daily business podcast, Business Essentials Daily, wherever you're listening right now. From all of us at SoundCartel, thanks so much for listening.